So if everybody can keep that mindset and they're like, oh, it's a stack of newspapers, we're going to turn that into beets basically, or carrots, or whatever it is we're going to grow. And we are going to compost that paper first. So we aren't just throwing paper around that's going to be anywhere. We're going to turn it into dirt in the process of carbon and nitrogen. Okay, go ahead.
I like that. And because it is made up of cellulose fibers sheathed in lignin, a highly resistant compound found in wood, which Eddie just told us how to take care of, lignin. Corn stalks and straw are similarly slow to break down because they are made up of a resistant form of cellulose. Although all of these materials can still be composted, their relatively slow rates of decomposition mean that not all of their carbon will be readily available to microorganisms. So a higher initial carbon-nitrogen ratio can be planned.
That's what we're talking about, adding more coffee grounds to it.
Exactly. Particle size is also a relevant consideration.
Super relevant.
Yeah, I found that in some of my things.
Can you repeat that?
Yes, particle size, whether you're talking about wood chips or sawdust or powdery sawdust, the particle, and even straw. There are many different sizes of straw and grass.
I'm gonna reiterate on that too. It can work against you in both ways, because you want the tiniest particle possible that the microbes can travel through, but once you get into something that's really powdery fine, like sawdust, like a really fine powdered sawdust, then you're better to mix that with something else and use it where the microbes can attack that little piece and then attack what it sticks to. So you use it kind of in a chain effect rather. Right. But if you just had a bin right here of pure sawdust and you added your nitrogen to it, even if you added liquid nitrogen to it, it's going to bind up and pack, and it's not actually going to drain.
And when it packs like
that, it's going to, the carbon is going to stay, none of the nitrogen's going to get to it, none of the oxygen's going to get to it, and it'll just stay there for years and never compost. That's why actually composting piles for organic farms, the type of composting we're doing here, unless you do it the right way, you can get pathogens in your piles if you're not doing it proper. So most compost piles for farms, if we were doing this, they'd make us turn them every 14 days and actually keep spinning in the nitrogen around it so that it's thoroughly going through the whole thing. We're not bound to that because we're using a different system. We're using earthworms. Vermiculture is different. We're going to let it compost where it does. Pockets of it aren't going to be composted so well, but most of it is. The worms are going to go in and finish that process up and really dig it into what we want it to be. Because if you took a pile and you did thermophilic composting, you're going to have exactly what you threw in it. You're going to lose a bit of the nutrients and a bit of the potassium and nitrogen, but you're basically going to have, other than what leaches out, what you put into it. When you work with worms, you're going to have that entire compost pile of what you put into it. Then you're going to have minerals from 15 feet down. You're going to have microbiological things out of their stomach flora. You're going to have dirt that they've mixed in with it and other minerals, and everything that's in their castings that's going to make it far more superior. So you're going to add quite a bit of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus to it as well. And it's going to be totally safe and pathogen free.
Yeah, okay. I found in my own things, working with mushroom substrates and whatnot, a combination of coarse and medium and fine is really good. If it gets too fine, like he's talking about, well, he told you what happens. And also, that leads to different kinds of anaerobic.
Anaerobic meaning without oxygen. That's where pathogens were mostly associated with. If you just will stick to those two words, anaerobic and aerobic. Aerobic meaning oxygen. We're making this tank aerobic by adding oxygen bubbles to it. We're diffusing more dissolved oxygen into the water. It works on land, water, anything. Worms can actually live underwater as long as there's enough oxygen pumping. They can live for weeks and weeks in pure water. They can absorb the oxygen through their skin. Eventually it'll overwhelm them and just sog them out too bad, but they can live for weeks in pure water as long as there's a lot of oxygen present. So in all of our, that's another reason they want you to spin the piles for composting as well, is to increase the oxygen levels in the pile. What I've been working with on Molokai, we actually compost for the slaughterhouse, which is blood and guts and stuff that you wouldn't imagine you could compost. So what we did is we took wood chips and we created buns. We put the cow slop in the center of the buns, and then we put the wood chips all around it, and then we put aerators in it, air stones. And then we wet the piles down from the carbon, and we bubbled the air up through the bottom of the piles. It's pretty crazy what happened. They started to compost just at an incredible rate. We also added a bacteria, which you guys know in yogurt, lactobacillus, and a few other different what is it? I can't remember the words right now, but it's activated by sunlight. One of them is activated by sunlight. Another one of them is a yeast, an airborne yeast, and another one is yogurt culture, basically, and they call it EM, efficient microbes. So that's what we inoculated the piles with. Between the inoculation of the piles and the air stones on the bottom of it, by the time we added the worms next to it, in 6 months, about 50 pounds of worms took down like 3,000 pounds of carbon and cow slop. And by the time we got into the pile without it ever being turned, we sent it to the university to be tested for pathogens. It was really clean. Its numbers were through the roof and what it had in it. And you could dig into it. It was just rich black gold. You couldn't tell the difference between where the carbon and the animals were in it. So just whatever, as layman's terms for something like that. Okay, so going to talk about oxygen now.
So it's really good to have a mixture of particle sizes.
And that's for oxygen for the most part.
Because the little pieces will help the big pieces get... you'd think of it as infected, but inoculated, yeah. Particle size is also a relevant consideration. Although the same amount of carbon is contained in comparable masses of wood chips and sawdust, the larger surface area in the sawdust makes its carbon more readily available for microbial use.
But if it's spaced out properly, so it's getting oxygen and moisture in it, not if it's packed down, it'll work against it.
Yeah. I'm glad he said that again. I didn't have to. It needed to be said again. Yeah. Now, on to oxygen. Another essential ingredient for successful composting is oxygen. As microorganisms oxidize carbon for energy, oxygen is used up and carbon dioxide is produced. Without sufficient oxygen, which is exactly what he's talking about here, the turning, the tumbling, the air stones, this is why Eddie's doing this. Without sufficient oxygen, the process will become anaerobic and produce undesirable odors, including the rotten egg smell of hydrogen sulfide gas, okay? So how much oxygen is sufficient, you may be wondering, to maintain aerobic conditions? Although the atmosphere is 21% oxygen, aerobic microbes can survive at concentrations as low as 5%. Oxygen concentrations greater than 10% are considered optimal for maintaining aerobic composting. Some compost systems are able to maintain adequate oxygen supply passively, if you set it up right.
That's what we are doing. We're doing passive oxygen supplied to them right there. No. By the way that we put it in, the availability of the microbes to be able to move through it. We have coffee grounds. The newspaper is a little bit harder to break down. It also leaves a lot of air pockets. Everything can move through it and it can just sit. Also, the third key into that is passively with us is earthworms, which takes it to a whole nother level. They come in and finish the rest of that process. So we're not making compost piles where we're flipping them and turning them all the time to get our oxygen in there. We're setting them right from the beginning with the ratios that we set up on them and allowing the bugs and everything else to create the right oxygen and have it set up.
So keep going. So to restate it the way that Eddie has set it up, it's passively creating oxygen, and that's why Eddie doesn't need any air stones over in his compost piles, because he set them up right.
Well, I mean, if I wanted to throw air stones on the bottom of these piles, we will eventually. We'll do a couple piles with air stones, because I just want to show you guys the difference and how much more oxygen can increase it and how much faster. You can do compost in 10, 14 days. It all depends how fast you want to cook it. If you spin it and you add your carbon and nitrogen ratios high on the nitrogen, but you keep spinning it and moving it and using really small particles in it and you really take care of it, you can do compost really, really fast, or you can do compost really, really slow. I'm going for the slow method, the passive method, because of what we're doing. What we're really doing is raising worms, is the bigger picture here.
What's an air stone?
An air stone is this right here.
I've seen the bottom of the aquarium.
This is a little small air stone that's making air literally out of a stone, and there's air being pumped into the stone, and it's creating bubbles, just like that in your fish tank. So we're actually dissolving oxygen into the water. A compost pile, imagine the same thing, a pile on top, but instead of this, a mat that just pushes air up constantly is pumped from the bottom of the thing. What's really good idea that I've been working on Molokai is I've been taking mechanical windmills and a pipe. That we had an old mechanical windmill there. We took a pipe and we basically just forced air under the pile in a pipe. So we took a piece of no, the same plastic I have right here. Poked holes all along the plastic, and then we just pumped air underneath the pile. Every once in a while, we stuck the hose right in that same pile with air and water coming out of the hose from the bottom. and the results are pretty incredible from that. And what was happening is every time the windmill would spin, its little diaphragm would shove air up the hose. So every time it was windy, we were basically forcing air naturally into the pile.